Rome did not forgive flight. In an empire that stretched from the fog-shrouded hills of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, where marble temples kissed the sky and aqueducts carried civilization across impossible distances, Rome built its grandeur on a foundation most citizens refused to name: the bodies of the enslaved. Nearly 1 in 3 people walking the streets of the Eternal City wore invisible chains. They served in kitchens and quarries, in bedchambers and battlefields. They were the empire's breath, its muscle, its silenced majority. And when they ran, Rome made them scream. Escape was not merely a crime in the Roman world. It was a wound to the cosmic order itself. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, held absolute dominion over his property, and enslaved people were precisely that, property with a pulse. When a slave fled, they didn't just steal themselves from their master's inventory. They committed an act of metaphysical rebellion, shattering the illusion that Rome's hierarchy was natural, inevitable, divine. So Rome responded with theatre, because punishment in the Roman Empire was never private. It was opera, it was warning, it was a language written in scars and blood, performed on street corners and in amphitheatres, ensuring that every enslaved person, every freedman, every citizen understood: this is what happens when you defy us. The punishments for fugitivi, those who dared to run, were designed not merely to discipline the individual, but to terrorize the collective. 5 methods, in particular, exemplify Rome's genius for cruelty. Branding that turned flesh into billboard, chaining that transformed bodies into architecture, arena deaths that made murder into matinee, whippings that knew no mercy, and minds that swallowed souls whole. This is their story, not sanitized, not distant, not metaphor. This is how Rome held the world by the throat, and what it did to those who tried to breathe free. Branded for life. The mark of the fugitive. Imagine the iron, not cold, searing, white hot from the brazier's heart, shaped into 3 letters that will define the rest of your existence. The smell reaches you first: acrid metal, burning charcoal, the sweating fear of the other slaves who hold you down. You can't move. Your head is gripped, tilted back, forehead exposed. The brand approaches your skin, and in the half-second before contact, you see it. FVG, fugitivus, runaway. The pain is instant, cosmic, annihilating. Flesh bubbles and blackens, nerves scream. The sizzle of your own skin is the last sound before your voice breaks into something inhuman. When they release you, you are no longer who you were. You are marked, owned, warned. An advertisement to every passerby. This one tried to be free. Branding was Rome's most efficient technology of social control. It was permanent tattooing through fire, a practice borrowed from livestock management and applied without hesitation to human beings. Roman law explicitly permitted masters to brand enslaved people who had attempted escape, a right encoded in the Digest of Justinian and practiced across centuries. The forehead was the preferred canvas, visible, undeniable, a denial of personhood etched in keloid scar tissue. The letters varied by offense and owner. FVG or FVR for fugitivus, sometimes FVC for fur, thief, CAL for calumniator, false accuser. Owners also branded enslaved people with their initials, personal signatures on human flesh. One archaeological find from Pompeii preserves graffiti mocking a branded slave, Felix, slave of Sulla, marked on the forehead. The joke was public, the humiliation eternal. The tools were brutally simple. A bronze or iron branding rod, heated until it glowed amber in the dim light of workshop or villa courtyard. No anesthesia, no aftercare. Infection was common. Scarring was the point. Some owners preferred small brands, discreet marks near the hairline. Others wanted billboards, large, disfiguring letters that announced the crime from across the forum. Women bore unique terror in this punishment. Roman ideals of feminine beauty prized smooth, unblemished skin. A brand destroyed marriage prospects for enslaved women hoping to marry after manumission. It marked them as corrupted property, damaged goods in a society obsessed with physical perfection. For women who worked in proximity to citizen households, nurses, attendants, concubines, the brand was social obliteration. But branding was more than physical. It was psychological warfare. The brand created what we might now call a permanent criminal record. A visible history that followed the enslaved person even if they were later freed. Manumission did not erase the scar. Former slaves with forehead brands carried their past like a billboard, unable to escape the categories Rome assigned them. They could not blend into crowds. They could not reinvent themselves. The empire had written its judgment into their faces. Roman writers rarely discuss the moral weight of branding. To them, it was simply pragmatic. Pliny the Elder mentions branding in his Natural History as casually as he describes agricultural techniques. Columella, the agronomist, recommends branding runaway farm slaves to prevent future escapes. There's no hand-wringing, no ethical debate. The enslaved are property. Property must be marked. Yet in the silences of the historical record, we sense resistance. Some enslaved people tried to remove their brands, cutting away the scarred flesh, though this left even more grotesque marks. Others wore their brands with bitter pride, transforming stigma into identity. In the catacombs and graffiti of Roman subcultures, there are hints that branded slaves formed their own communities, finding solidarity in shared disfigurement. One chilling detail: branding was sometimes done publicly, in the forum or at the slave market. The ritual had an audience. Masters wanted other slaves to watch. They wanted the sizzle and the screaming to echo. This was pedagogy through pain, a lesson taught to hundreds through the suffering of one. The Latin verb inscriber, to inscribe, was used for both writing on papyrus and branding on flesh. Rome understood both as forms of record keeping. The enslaved body was parchment, pain was ink, and the message was always the same. You belong to us. You will always belong to us, and if you run, we will write it on your face. Chained at the gate, humiliation as warning. The Roman doorway was a sacred threshold. It separated the domus, the ordered, civilized household, from the chaotic street. Gods protected it. Janus, the two-faced deity of beginnings and transitions, and the Lares, household spirits who dwelled in doorway shrines. To cross a Roman threshold was to move between worlds, between private and public, between family and forum. And it was here, at this charged boundary, that Rome chained its runaways. The punishment was called ad ianuam, at the door. An escaped slave, once recaptured, would be shackled to the entryway of their master's home, locked in iron collars and leg irons, displayed like a grotesque ornament for days or even weeks. Passers-by would see them, neighbors would see them. Other slaves, entering and exiting the household, would step over or around them, absorbing the lesson. This is what happens when you flee. The chains were not metaphorical. Archaeological excavations across the Roman world have unearthed iron collars, collaria with inscribed warnings. I have run away. Hold me. Return me to my master. Some collars had protruding spikes to prevent the wearer from lying down or resting their head. Others were designed to chafe and cut, ensuring that every breath was accompanied by pain. Imagine the position, kneeling or crouching by the threshold, unable to stand fully, exposed to every season's cruelty. In summer, the Mediterranean sun turned iron into brand marks against the neck. In winter, the cold leached into bone. Rain brought no relief, only mud, shivering, the damp rot of clothes that never dried. Food, if it came, was scraps. Water, if provided, was rationed. The body's needs, urination, defecation, were performed in place, adding humiliation to agony. But the physical suffering was only half the design. The punishment's genius lay in its location. The doorway was the most trafficked space in a Roman household. Clients came at dawn for the morning salutatio, where they paid respects to their patron. Merchants delivered goods, neighbors exchanged gossip. Every visitor saw the chained slave. Every visitor absorbed the message. For women, this punishment carried additional layers of violation. Roman honor culture prized female pudicitia, modesty, sexual virtue, the guarding of the body from public gaze. An enslaved woman chained at the door had her body turned into spectacle. She could not cover herself adequately. She could not shield herself from stares, comments, or hands. Passers-by could, and did, make lewd remarks, touching without consequence. She was no longer a person. She was an installation. Roman comedy preserves traces of this practice, revealing how normalized it had become. In Plautus's Mostellaria, a character jokes about a slave being nailed to the doorpost as punishment. The audience laughed. In Asinaria, another play, a chained slave at the door is a background detail, barely worth mentioning, just part of the household landscape. The horror had become furniture, Legal texts confirm the practice's official sanction. The digest discusses whether a chained slave at the door counts as in custody for legal purposes. Answer: yes. They're under control even if outdoors. The casualness of the legal language, the bureaucratic precision applied to human suffering, is its own kind of testimony. Archaeologists have found evidence at Pompeii and Herculaneum, iron rings embedded in door frames, positioned at human height, corroded from centuries of exposure. These weren't for tying horses or dogs. The placement, the size, the wear patterns, they tell the story of bodies chained there, exposed and suffering, turned into living warnings. And the psychological dimensions cut deepest. The doorway was a threshold the slave had crossed in their escape, a boundary they had transgressed. To be chained there was to have their flight undone symbolically, to be frozen in the very act of transgression. They could see freedom beyond, the street, the possibility of movement, but they could not reach it. The few feet between their chains and liberty were unbridgeable. It was torture by proximity. Some slaves died chained at the door, from exposure, from infection, from despair. Their bodies were left there as warnings even after death, collapsing slowly into rot and bone. Others were released after sufficient display time, their punishment measured not in fixed days, but in the master's judgment of adequate terror. The question wasn't, have they suffered enough? It was, have the others seen them suffer enough? Rome built an empire on thresholds, between citizen and non-citizen, free and enslaved, human and property. The chained slave at the door embodied all these boundaries, collapsed into a single, suffering body. They were the punctuation mark at the end of Rome's sentence about power. This far and no farther. Thrown into the arena, punishment as entertainment, the Colosseum could hold 50,000 screaming Romans. On a blazing afternoon, with sand glittering white under the Mediterranean sun and the air thick with the smell of blood, wild animals and sweat-drenched humanity, the crowd roared for death, but not the death of gladiators. Those were trained athletes, expensive investments, fighters who earned respect even in defeat. No, the crowd had gathered for something rawer, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, and among those condemned, dragged naked or near naked into the arena, weaponless, screaming, were enslaved women who had tried to run. Rome did not waste its arenas solely on criminals guilty of murder or treason. The games were a comprehensive system of social control, a blood-soaked stage where the empire demonstrated the consequences of defiance. Runaway slaves, especially those who had fled multiple times, or who had done so spectacularly, or who had been made examples by vindictive masters, were fed to this machine of public execution. The mechanics were precise. The condemned were often costumed to play roles from mythology. Icarus, whose wax wings melted, slaves set on fire and dropped from heights. Orpheus, torn apart by beasts, slaves ripped to pieces by lions or bears. Daedalus, devoured in the labyrinth, slaves hunted through constructed mazes while animals pursued them. Pain was aestheticized. Murder was narrative. Women condemned to the arena faced uniquely gendered horrors. Roman sexual mores forbade respectable women from public nudity, but enslaved women convicted of flight were stripped bare before tens of thousands of eyes. Their nakedness was part of the punishment. Humiliation and dehumanization before the killing blow. Some were bound to stakes or crosses in the center of the arena while animals were released. Others were given the cruelest illusion, freedom to run, to scramble across the sand, while leopards or bears or wild dogs pursued them. The historical record is sparse but sickening. Martial, the poet of the arena, describes with glee a woman playing the role of pacifier, forced into a sexual scenario with a bull before being killed. Suetonius mentions Nero's fondness for executing criminals, including runaway slaves, dressed as mythological figures. Cassius Dio records that under certain emperors, condemned women were forced to fight each other before being given to animals, adding combat humiliation to their deaths. But perhaps most chilling is the casualness of the mentions. These executions weren't aberrations. They were matinee performances, held during the Meridiani Ludi, the midday executions that entertained the crowd between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiator contests. The audience ate, drank, socialized, and watched human beings torn to pieces as a lunchtime diversion. The animals themselves were starved beforehand to ensure aggression. Lions from North Africa, bears from the Alps, wolves from Germania, bulls from Spain. Rome scoured its territories for beasts capable of spectacular kills. Trainers used scent cues, blood-soaked clothing, to direct animals toward the condemned. The kills were often slow. A lion might toy with its victim for minutes before the fatal bite. A bear might maul without killing immediately. The crowd evaluated the deaths on entertainment value. A quick kill was boring. Prolonged suffering was applause-worthy. Women who survived the first wave of animals, rare but documented, were often subjected to additional torments. Some were burned alive on pyres in the arena's center. Others were crucified along the arena walls and left to die slowly while the games continued. Still others were bound and used as archery targets, pierced by arrows shot from the stands by nobles paying for the privilege of participating in the execution. The logic was deterrence through spectacle. Rome wanted every slave in the empire to understand. Flight leads not just to death, but to death as entertainment. Your suffering will be watched. Your pain will be enjoyed. You will die not as a martyr, but as a joke, a role in someone else's story, a prop in the empire's grandest theatre. Philosophers occasionally wrestled with the morality. Seneca, in one of his letters, describes leaving the arena disgusted after witnessing midday executions. Man, sacred to man, is killed for sport and merriment, but Seneca's objection was minority opinion. Most Romans accepted the games as natural, necessary, even virtuous, a display of Roman power, a lesson in the consequences of disorder. The arena was Rome's cathedral of cruelty. It sanctified violence. It made murder into ritual, and it ensured that the enslaved population, a third of the empire, absorbed a lesson more visceral than any law code could provide. You are not human. You are spectacle. And if you run, we will make sure the world watches you die. No graves, no memorials, just sand, raked smooth after the bodies were dragged away, ready for the next performance. Whipped without mercy, the Roman scourge. The sound alone was a punishment. The crack of leather on flesh, sharp, wet, echoing, followed by the thud of metal fragments tearing muscle. Then the scream, always the scream, repeated, rhythmic, relentless, until the voice broke and only ragged breathing remained, punctuated by the thwack, thwack, thwack of the flagrum doing its work. Whipping was Rome's most common punishment, its most casual violence. It required no elaborate setup, no special location, no legal process. A master could order it on whim, a foreman could administer it in the fields, a household overseer could do it in the atrium while the family dined nearby, the sound of the lash providing ambient background to dinner conversation. For runaway slaves, whipping was almost inevitable, either as the punishment itself or as prelude to something worse. The Romans perfected the art of the scourge. The flagrum was no simple leather strap. It was an engineered instrument of agony. A wooden handle attached to multiple leather thongs, each tipped with weights, metal balls, bone fragments, sharpened hooks, lead pellets. When it struck, it didn't just bruise, it tore. The weighted tips bit deep, ripping away skin, exposing subcutaneous fat, sometimes reaching muscle or even bone. A skilled flogger aimed for maximum pain and minimum lethality. Though death was always possible, strokes were concentrated on the back, buttocks, and legs, areas with enough flesh to absorb punishment, but enough nerve density to ensure agony. The first few strokes raised welts. The next dozen broke skin. By the 20th, the back was a landscape of torn meat, blood pooling in the wounds, flesh hanging in ribbons. There was no legal limit to how many strokes an enslaved person could receive. Unlike Roman citizens who were protected by law from excessive flogging, slaves had no such safeguard. The paterfamilias held absolute authority. If he wanted 100 lashes, he ordered it. If he wanted the slave beaten unconscious, it was done. If death resulted, well, that was unfortunate property damage, nothing more. Women received no special mercy. Roman law made no gendered distinction in flogging. An enslaved woman who ran faced the same flagrum as a man, her back torn open with the same precision. But the social meaning differed. For men, the lash was a tool of discipline. For women, it carried sexual dimensions, the exposure of the body, the positioning, often bent over or hung from posts, the vulnerability. Whipping scenes in Roman literature sometimes blur into sexual violence, the pain eroticized for free male audiences. The locations of whipping varied strategically. Private whippings occurred in the household, in cellars or courtyards, witnessed only by other slaves who were forced to watch. The message: this could be you. Public whippings happened in forums, marketplaces, crossroads, anywhere crowds gathered. Runaway slaves were sometimes whipped at the site of their recapture, their bodies beaten in the very location they'd tried to reach freedom. Roman writers referenced whipping with disturbing casualness. Horace jokes about his father threatening him with whippings as a child, comparing paternal discipline to the treatment of slaves. Juvenal, the satirist, mentions masters who whip slaves for trivial offenses, serving dinner late, failing to smile sufficiently, existing too loudly. Petronius, in the Satyricon, depicts a household where flogging is as routine as meal preparation. The whip also served as prelude. Before branding, slaves were whipped to soften them, to break resistance. Before arena deaths, they were scourged as part of the spectacle. Before being sent to the mines, they received floggings to mark the transition from household to industrial slavery. The lash was Rome's punctuation mark, its way of emphasizing every other punishment. Some enslaved people died from whipping, from blood loss, from infection, from shock. Their bodies were disposed of without ceremony. Others survived but bore the scars for life, their backs a topographic map of suffering. These scars served as identification. A heavily scarred back marked someone as difficult, rebellious, prone to flight. It was a second kind of branding, written in keloid tissue rather than burn marks. There's a horrible efficiency to the whip. It required no infrastructure. It was reusable. It could be calibrated for different levels of punishment. A light flogging for minor offenses, a severe one for major crimes. It created immediate, visible suffering, satisfying a master's rage or a crowd's bloodlust, and it left survivors marked, weakened, easier to control. Roman law even had a term for the condition of enslaved people too broken by whipping to work: homines claudi, lame men, the term applied to all genders. These were slaves whose bodies had been so damaged by repeated flogging that they were economically worthless. Masters sometimes freed them, not as mercy, but as disposal, dumping the unsaleable into the streets to beg or starve. Yet in this ocean of cruelty, there are hints of resistance. Some slaves learned to position their bodies to minimize damage, protecting vital areas. Others formed silent solidarities, caring for the wounded in secret, cleaning and binding wounds, keeping each other alive despite the violence. These acts of care, undocumented, unremembered, were their own form of rebellion, a refusal to let Rome's lash have the final word. The whip was Rome's favorite tool because it was intimate and public, personal and political. It demonstrated mastery. It enacted hierarchy, and it could be deployed anywhere, anytime, for any reason. In the sound of leather on flesh, Rome spoke its clearest language. You are ours, and we will hurt you as we please. Sent to the mines, death in darkness. There were fates worse than the arena. At least in the Colosseum, death came relatively quickly, hours at most, sometimes minutes. At least the sun shone on your final moments. At least the sky was visible. The mines offered none of these mercies. Damnatio in metallum, condemnation to the mines, was Rome's cruelest long-term punishment, a sentence that meant slow death in subterranean darkness, toiling in conditions designed to extract maximum labor before the body inevitably collapsed. It was Rome's industrial hell, and runaway slaves, especially repeat offenders, were among its most common victims. The empire's hunger for metal was insatiable. Silver for currency, gold for temples and triumphs, iron for weapons and tools, copper for infrastructure, tin, lead, mercury. All flowed from mines scattered across Rome's territories. Noricum, modern Austria, Sardinia, southern Spain, Hispania, Dacia, Romania, Cyprus, North Africa, and all required bodies to dig, haul, and die. The mines were legal black holes. Once condemned, a slave ceased to exist in civil terms. They could not own property, testify in court, or marry. They were damnati, the damned living ghosts excised from society's ledger. Many were branded or tattooed before being sent underground. Final marks to prevent escape, though escape from the mines was nearly impossible. The working conditions were apocalyptic. Tunnels extended hundreds of feet underground, narrow passages barely wide enough for a human body to crawl through. The air was thick with dust, silica particles that shredded lungs with every breath, leading to miners' lung. a slow suffocation as scar tissue replaced functioning respiratory tissue. Most miners developed chronic coughing within months, coughed blood within a year, and died within 5. Light was minimal, oil lamps and torches, which consumed precious oxygen and filled the tunnels with smoke. Workers toiled in near darkness, their eyes damaged by the strain of seeing in dim, flickering illumination. Many went blind. Heat was extreme. The deeper the shaft, the hotter the air, until miners worked in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, naked and soaked in sweat, their skin slick with mineral dust turned to mud. The labor was killing. Workers used pickaxes and hammers to break ore from rock faces, their hands blistered and bleeding, their backs bent in spaces too small to stand. They carried ore in baskets or sacks, hauling 100-pound loads through narrow tunnels, climbing crude ladders or ropes, slipping on wet stone, falling to their deaths with grim regularity. Collapse was constant threat. Tunnels caved in without warning, burying miners alive, their bodies left entombed because retrieval was too costly. For enslaved women, the mines added layers of gendered suffering. They performed the same brutal labor as men. There was no consideration for physical differences, but they also faced constant sexual violence from overseers and guards. Pregnancy was common. Childbirth in the mines, a death sentence for mother, child, or both. There were no midwives, no medical care. Women gave birth in the tunnels and returned to work, their newborns left to die in the darkness or, occasionally, kept alive by other women workers in grim acts of collective care. The mines had minimal infrastructure for life. Food was whatever could be brought in cheaply: moldy bread, thin gruel, occasionally salted fish. Water was often contaminated by mineral runoff, lead, mercury, arsenic, poisoning the workforce slowly. There were no baths, no clean clothes. Miners wore rags until they disintegrated, their bodies coated in layers of grime and dust that never washed off. Disease spread viciously. Tuberculosis thrived in the damp, crowded conditions. Dysentery was endemic. Infections from the countless small cuts and abrasions became gangrenous. There were no doctors, no treatment. Sick miners worked until they collapsed, then were dragged to the side and left to die. Their bodies were disposed of in abandoned shafts or simply left to rot. But perhaps the cruelest dimension was psychological. The erasure. Unlike the arena where death was public spectacle, death in the mines was invisible. No one witnessed it. No one recorded it. Miners disappeared into the earth and were forgotten. There are no memorials, no inscriptions commemorating the enslaved who died underground. They were extracted like the ore they mined, consumed, used up, discarded. Historical sources are sparse, precisely because the mines were places of erasure. Occasional references in legal texts mention damnatio in metallum as a standard punishment. Strabo, the geographer, describes the silver mines of Spain and mentions the criminals and barbarians worked there until death. Diodorus Siculus provides one of the few detailed accounts, describing Egyptian gold mines where workers labored in chains, their bodies bent and broken, dying in great numbers from the conditions. Archaeological evidence fills some gaps. Excavations of Roman mines reveal horrifying details. Narrow tunnels barely 3 feet high, forcing workers into perpetual crouches. Ventilation shafts so inadequate that oxygen levels would have been dangerously low. Skeletal remains showing signs of severe malnutrition, bone disease, and traumatic injuries. One mine in southern Spain contained the remains of hundreds of individuals, many with evidence of violent death, crushed skulls, severed limbs, bodies buried in rubble. Some mines operated for centuries, consuming generation after generation of the condemned. Workers sent there knew they would never leave. The sentence was effectively death, just slow, measured out over months or years of maximum suffering and labor extraction. Rome got its silver, its gold, its iron, and the enslaved paid with their bodies, their lungs, their lives, all in darkness, all forgotten. The mines were where Rome sent the people it wanted to erase, not kill gloriously, not display as warnings, but simply disappear. To work until there was nothing left to work with, to be consumed entirely, body and memory, leaving only the metal that built the empire's glory. Conclusion: Rome's architecture of Fear 5 punishments, 5 variations on a single, brutal theme. Defiance will destroy you. Rome did not simply kill runaways. It did not merely recapture and return them to bondage. It created an elaborate architecture of fear. a comprehensive system of pain calibrated to different audiences and different deterrent goals. The brand was permanent billboard. The chain was public installation. The arena was blood opera. The whip was intimate terror. The mines were industrial erasure. Each punishment addressed a different dimension of control. Branding attacked identity, turning the body into a permanent record of crime, ensuring the fugitive could never escape their past. Chaining at the threshold transformed the individual into architecture, a living warning embedded in the physical structure of the household. Arena executions made death into mass entertainment, teaching entire populations that flight ends not in martyrdom, but in spectacle. Whipping combined intimacy and routine, a punishment so common it became background noise, normalizing violence into the everyday texture of Roman life. And the mines? The mines solved the problem of persistent resistors by erasing them entirely, disappearing them into the earth to be consumed and forgotten. This was not random cruelty. This was engineered oppression, systematized terror with clear goals, to prevent escape, to punish those who tried, and to ensure that every enslaved person in the empire internalized the consequences of rebellion. Rome ruled its enslaved population of millions not through constant direct supervision, that would have been impossible, but through a pedagogy of pain. The punishments were lessons, taught through bodies, reinforced through repetition, until the violence became self-sustaining. The genius of Rome's system lay in its dual nature, visibility and invisibility. Some punishments, branding, chaining, arena deaths, whipping, were aggressively public, designed to be seen, to generate witnesses, to create shared knowledge of consequences. Others, the mines, were deliberately hidden, disappearing the condemned into darkness, erasing them so completely they became cautionary absences. The message was clear: defy us visibly, and we'll destroy you visibly. Persist in defiance, and we'll make you disappear. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but necessary. Systems of mass incarceration, particularly those built on racialized hierarchies, echo Rome's logic. Punishment as spectacle and warning, bodies made into examples, entire populations controlled through calibrated violence and the threat of it. The tools have changed. We don't brand foreheads or feed people to lions, but the architecture remains. Fear as governance, pain as pedagogy, suffering as social control, and yet, resistance endured. Despite the brands, slaves removed them or wore them as badges of defiant identity. Despite the chains, communities formed solidarities, caring for the punished, keeping them alive. Despite the arena, some fought back or died with dignity intact, refusing to perform the terror Rome scripted. Despite the whip, bodies healed and rebellions rekindled. Despite the mines, memories persisted. Fragments, whispers, the refusal to be entirely erased. Rome's empire of iron and ash eventually fell. The mechanisms of its cruelty crumbled with its aqueducts and amphitheaters. But the enslaved people who endured these punishments, whose names we mostly don't know, whose faces we'll never see, whose voices were silenced by the machinery of oppression, they were as much architects of history as the emperors and generals. They built Rome with their labor. They resisted Rome with their flight, and they endured Rome's punishments with a resilience that no amount of branding, chaining, bloodsport, whipping, or burial alive could fully extinguish. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who lived surrounded by slavery's horrors, wrote words that indict his own society. They are slaves. No, they are human beings. They are slaves? No, they are comrades. They are slaves? No, they are friends, humble friends. Rome tried to make them less than human. It failed. The scars they bore, the pain they endured, the deaths they suffered, all testify not to Rome's power, but to the breathtaking cruelty required to maintain a system built on human bondage. Every brand, every chain, every whip stroke, every death in the arena, every body lost in the mines, each is an admission that the enslaved never truly submitted, that Rome had to constantly, violently, spectacularly force obedience because it could never truly secure consent. This is Rome's legacy, an empire of marble and law, poetry and engineering built on a foundation of bones, and in remembering the punishments, in refusing to look away from the branding iron, the arena sand, the mine shaft's darkness, we honor the humanity Rome tried so hard to destroy. They ran, Rome caught them, Rome hurt them, But Rome never, not for a moment, proved that they deserved it. They were human beings. They remain human beings. And their suffering, though distant, demands our witness. Remember them.